Now, please help me in welcoming our sponsor to the podium. Please put your hands together for Dr. Jeffrey Sherman, Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer of Horizon Therapeutics.
Can you hear me all right? So good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jeff Sherman. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Horizon Therapeutics, a biopharmaceutical company focused primarily on developing medicines for rare and rheumatic diseases. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to kick off the Hill's Future of Healthcare Summit Day Rare Disease Pillar, and my talk will be a lead into the panel that follows. At Horizon, we believe science and compassion must work together to transform lives, which is especially true for rare disease patients. Horizon is driven to deliver breakthrough medicines that address critical needs for patients impacted by rare diseases for which there are few available treatments. Since our founding in 2008, we have measured success by the number that matter most: the number of lives we've touched, the number of lives we change, and those we work tirelessly to treat. We work to understand the challenges our patients face every day, and we strive to go to incredible lengths to make a powerful difference for patients, their caregivers, and physicians. At the end of the day, we are all patients. Our CEO, Tim Walbert, has vocalized his personal struggles with 2 autoimmune disorders and founded Horizon on the mantra, "For us it's personal," because we are not just employees, we are all patients as well. The outcome we obtain for our patients and the lengths we go to achieve them reflects our ideals and our relentless commitment to every community we touch. This is why we feel our participation in today's summit is so important. Today, we have heard from experts across the healthcare spectrum about the challenges and opportunities we face as we seek to transform the healthcare system to make advances for patients. We've touched on how innovations in medical science, such as gene therapy, serve to shape the future of healthcare, and that policies and programs are needed to ensure access for patients and to sustain research and development. Members of Congress and leading public health officials have also shared efforts they have taken to address our most pressing healthcare issues, providing insights to access, affordability, and the health inequalities that continue to exist in this country. We now turn our attention to discuss Americans living with rare diseases, a community of immense unmet medical need, and some of the breakthroughs and discoveries that are underway to tackle these rare conditions. We'll consider some of the innovative treatments in this area that are currently in development and how we might begin to answer the question, how can we collaborate to conquer rare diseases, which are amongst the most challenging diseases of our time? When we think about disparities in the treatment for rare diseases, we must first start with the fact that there are over 7,000 rare diseases, 95% of which are without an FDA-approved treatment. We should also note that rare diseases are often genetic in nature and cannot be characterized as lifestyle diseases or instances where people aren't adequately taking care of themselves. For the approximately 30 million people living with a rare disease across the U.S., nearly 1 in 10 Americans, most of them are without an approved treatment, making this a vast area of unmet need. Rare disease patients should be considered a beyond underserved community when we consider the daily challenges that these patients, their caregivers, and healthcare providers face. Those same challenges seem even more immense when we look at them from a drug development perspective. At Horizon, we are determined to find answers to the question, how can we make meaningful strides in research and development as it applies to rare and rheumatic diseases? For example, one of our emerging development programs seeks to address a critical unmet need for patients living with a rare disease, active thyroid eye disease, which is a rare autoimmune disease and presently does not have an FDA-approved treatment. And this epitomizes what occurs with a rare disease and the journey that these patients go through. Thyroid eye disease, or TED, is a serious, progressive, and debilitating disease that can be sight-threatening. The symptoms include extremely dry eyes, blurred and double vision, protruding eyes, and misalignment of the eyes. It starts with an active phase that can last up to 3 years. Active TED is characterized by inflammation and tissue expansion behind the eye, causing serious damage. Currently, patients must suffer through this 3-year period of time until disease becomes inactive, and only then are left with permanent and sight-threatening consequences before they need complex and costly surgical procedures that may never fully restore their vision or appearance. My colleagues and I spend a lot of time listening to patients to truly understand their experience. Let me share with you a comment that one individual, Laquilla, recently shared with us about her experience with this disease. It's like your eyes are full of sand from the beach. That's how dry they are. They begin to protrude. They bulge out like you've been shocked by a ghost. I stopped socializing. I wouldn't let anyone see me. I covered all the mirrors in the house because I didn't want anyone to see me. When I walked to the mailbox, the kids in the neighborhood used to tease me and said, "Oh my God, look at the monster." Thyroid eye disease took a lot from me. I couldn't see my children for years. I could hear their voice over the phone, but I could not see them. That was unacceptable. She's had 9 surgeries to try and fix the damage and try to restore her vision. She's sharing her story next month as part of Graves' Disease Awareness Month, so others hopefully don't have to go with what she's did. And we're joining Laquilla in this effort. And what epitomizes her story is what other rare disease patients go through with their individual diseases. We have an investigational medicine in development for this condition, teprotumumab, and the phase 3 clinical trial recently met all primary and secondary endpoints and are working to submit a biologics license application, or BLA, for FDA review. This highlights what we are doing in research with TED and Graves' disease patients to educate on the severity of the disease and its impact on patients and their families, and this is what's needed with other rare diseases as well. Like TED, there are a large number of existing and emerging diseases with unmet need with little to no available treatments. Unfortunately, many of these diseases don't receive the same level of awareness and dedication to innovation. For those patients' sake, we must begin addressing these needs. No single company has the answer. At Horizon, we approach medical discovery grounded by the idea that all of us are better than any one of us. Collaboration amongst patients, their organizations, biopharmaceutical companies, academic researchers, as well as the medical community is essential to innovation. I've touched on the lack of approved treatments, but challenges in rare disease drug development start with the sheer number of rare diseases, along with more that are discovered each year. In most cases, patient populations are so small that there is insufficient patient data, along with a lack of understanding of the natural history of the diseases, making it difficult to conduct clinical trials. Rare diseases seriously impact the everyday lives of not only patients, but caregivers and families as well. In the first ever Europe-wide survey published in May 2017 by the European Organization for Rare Diseases, EURORDIS, the social needs of people living with rare diseases and their caregivers were explored. The study found that 7 in 10 patients and caregivers reduced or stopped professional activity due to their illness or that of a family member. Additionally, 8 in 10 surveyed reported difficulty completing daily tasks such as household chores and preparing meals, as well as being 3 times more unhappy and depressed than the general population. From a treatment perspective, there are a limited number of experts with adequate experience to study and treat rare diseases, which can partly be attributed to the small patient populations for these conditions, along with a lack of incentives to study these diseases. Even when experts are available, they tend to be geographically dispersed, forcing patients to travel significant distances to access care at great cost to their families. This creates even more inequities in the care for these patients. The lack of specialists in rare diseases can also lead to incorrect and delayed diagnoses, which can cause irreversible progression of a patient's condition, limit disease, education information, and often comes at significant cost to the healthcare system, factors that can leave patients and their families feeling overwhelmed and hopeless. Which all brings us to this question: what can we do collectively to galvanize people beyond this room and raise awareness in order to refine approaches to addressing rare diseases and make meaningful advances for the patients we serve? Certainly there has been some incredible work in this area from a number of stakeholders in the rare disease community. From a patient advocacy standpoint, colleagues at the National Organization for Rare Diseases, NORD, Global Genes, EveryLife Foundation, Eurordis, and Rare Diseases Forum, to name a few, work tirelessly to develop resources and empower patients and their families to advocate for policies that increase access to therapies, such as the Orphan Drug Act. While we've collectively made progress on behalf of rare disease patients, there is still much more to do. Today is part of the continued and sustained effort to address gaps in available care and treatment for these patients. Following my remarks, there will be a panel focusing on different stakeholder perspectives, industry, clinical research, provider, and patient. We'll hear from these experts how rare diseases impact millions of Americans and learn how to better understand major barriers to care, and most importantly, discuss ways to reduce those impediments. I know today's discussion will drive us further to our goal of achieving equitable access to quality care for rare diseases. In closing, we are all here because of our personal commitment and dedication to improving the patient experience, because it's our responsibility to build healthier communities for us and generations to come. I look forward to the panel discussion and the remainder of the summit to follow, as well as to working with each of you beyond our time here to develop solutions on behalf of patients who are counting on us each and every day. Thank you, and I now turn the session over to the moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Sherman. Everyone, thank you for staying engaged and here with us through our afternoon program. To discuss rare diseases, please welcome our first panel of the afternoon. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Carleen Riley, Director of Rare Tumor Initiative with the National Cancer Institute Cancer for Cancer Research, Julia Jenkins, Executive Director of EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases, Lori Riley, Executive Vice President with Pharma, and they will be joined on stage by the Hill's Julia Manchester. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as you all know, we're going to talk about rare diseases. And just to give you a little backdrop on this issue facing, there's currently between 25 and 30 million Americans currently living with a rare disease, which is defined by Congress as a disease that affects fewer than 200,000 people in the U.S. So I think, Julia, let's start with you. What rare diseases should we be focusing on, and how do we focus on those diseases going forward?
Well, first, I just want to thank you for having a panel on rare diseases. The foundation is celebrating its 10-year anniversary, and 10 years ago, no one was focused on rare diseases. And now we have hundreds of therapies in development, and we're starting to use the C word, which is cures. We never talked about cures 10 years ago because it wasn't scientifically possible. Also want to highlight the fact that we have academic and government as well as industry partner with patient organization. That is the way we are going to get treatments developed. It is a key partnership between all of the different stakeholders. Our foundation really focuses on the patient population that has nothing available. Many of our patients are using off-label therapies, are having to start their own biotech companies because companies aren't interested in them. So while there is a focus on a small handful of rare diseases, the need is huge. And our foundation this year is actually highlighting rare diseases as a public health crisis. People are afraid of Lyme disease, of Ebola, but we estimate that the U.S. is spending more than $1 trillion annually not treating rare diseases. We'll be coming out with a public health burden study later this year because it is a huge crisis for those who have a rare disease, and it has a huge impact on our economy.
And Lori, I think Julia touched a little bit on it in terms of how it seems that not many people were talking about rare diseases in a broader public discourse until the last decade, and I know that has to do a lot with cures, but why do you think it's taken so much for this idea to really get traction with the public?
Yeah, well, it was, back in 1983 when Congress actually passed the Orphan Drug Act. If you look at the decade prior to that, only 10 drugs had been approved in the entire decade leading up to the Orphan Drug Act for the treatment of rare diseases. Since that time, we've had over 600 new medicines get approved to treat rare diseases. And if you look at the last few years, anywhere from a third to a half of all drug approvals have been for rare diseases. And I think a big part of the reason is that Congress recognized a need and they put incentives in place to encourage companies to go after drugs in this space. For a very long time, obviously companies developed medicines that treated broad conditions, and they still do, right? Cardiovascular diseases, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and the like. But I think increasingly, because of the need, and it was talked about earlier, there's 7,000 rare diseases across this, that we know about. There's likely others. 30 million Americans have rare diseases. That's 1 in 10 Americans that have a rare disease. So while an individual disease may be considered rare itself, when you look at the population, 1 in 10 of us has a rare disease. And so I think over time, because of the incentives in place, because of the demand that exists, and the cooperation with government, patient organizations, and industry, we've seen a lot greater, thankfully, interest in development of medicines to treat rare conditions.
Right. And Carlene, tell us about the innovative treatments that could be around the corner in treating these rare diseases. I mean, we heard Julia talk about cures being talked about more. So just give us some insight into that, a look into the future, if you will.
Yeah, sure. So I work for the Center for Cancer Research, which is a research arm of the National Cancer Institute. And we've been working on rare diseases for a long time because we're in a position where we can really focus on unmet need and difficult problems that are hard to address in the outside. So just as an example of a really tour de force that's coming through very soon is recently the FDA granted a breakthrough designation for selumetinib for a rare tumor called neurofibromatosis. And I just want to sort of give a context to sort of what went into all of that, because it went from identifying the gene that was changed in these patients that have neurofibromatosis, and then that gene couldn't be targeted. So you had to find other ways of trying to address this disease. The patient samples don't grow very well outside of the patient, so new mouse models had to be made to even be able to test the drug. So all along, there's a huge collaborative pipeline all through the country of scientists and clinicians, but most importantly, patients just being willing to participate and help out. So what really was one of the breakthroughs here was the ability to really understand the natural history of the disease. So we have what's called a natural history study, which means we try and understand how this disease normally happens. And for many, many rare diseases, this isn't known. And so this natural history study allowed the doctors to understand and show the FDA what normally happens and how the drug then changes what normally happens. And to give you an idea of just the struggles there, my colleague, Dr. Brigitte Wiedemann, tells a story of a young boy with a very large neurofibroma on his arm. And it was painful, and he couldn't move his arm. And he went on this drug. He tapered down his pain medicine. And his mother said, he's doing better because now he's wrestling with his sister. And so it takes a lot of innovation and creativity to turn he's wrestling with his sister into something that's rigorous and quantifiable to be able to get the FDA to say, yes, this drug is important for these patients. And that's the kind of timeline and the struggles that these treatments have to go through to get to the point where they're approved. So now we're building on that background to start looking across all rare tumors that affect children and teens and young adults.
What advocacy levels on Capitol Hill are taking place to really make lawmakers, if you will, more aware of these rare diseases, more aware of the, all the advancements that are happening in this field? Because we know that healthcare is obviously talked about much in Washington, but we hear about healthcare costs or maybe more common measures. We don't hear a lot about rare diseases. So I'll pose this to all three of you. what kind of conversation is surrounding rare diseases on Capitol Hill?
Happy to start. I think, increasingly there are conversations, again, as many patient organizations are up talking to lawmakers about it. I have a personal connection to ALS, which is a rare disease. I lost my mother to it. And there are now a group of advocates who are very, very engaged on Capitol Hill. Recently got additional appropriations authorized for spending at the National Institutes of Health in the disease. So I do think there is energy, particularly around many of the different patient organizations. I will say, though, that some on Capitol Hill have questioned the Orphan Drug Act and the incentives that are provided in it. Some have said, have we over-incentivized rare disease development? And so I would caution a little bit that it's not a given that everyone says, oh, it's great that there's all of this orphan drug research. I would argue that when we still have 95% of patients with rare diseases without a treatment, it is incredible for me that anyone would consider that we've over-incentivized here. And in fact, the opposite. We need to be doing more in the orphan drug space. But there is some debate and interest in Capitol Hill to reopen the Orphan Drug Act. And I think there is some concern about what could happen in terms of diminishing some of the incentives that I believe have been very important to leading to the progress we've made.
So I have to agree. We need more incentives, not less. With, again, 95% of our patient community with no FDA-approved treatments, we need incentives to repurpose for rare disease patients. We need incentives to better diagnose our rare disease patients. There actually is a bill in Congress right now called the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act. We have a lot of our advocates out meeting with their members of Congress to advocate for that piece of legislation. It's actually one of the most successful public health programs that exists, and if it is not reauthorized by this year, we will have failed to adequately diagnose these newborns with these rare life-threatening diseases that could be treated right from birth and have no adverse effects.
Carlene, do you want to go next?
I can't comment too much on the Hill, but I do want to add to something that you said, which is that not only is all of this important for the individual rare disease patient, but rare diseases have taught us so much about all disease. And what we're seeing right now across all cancers is that as we learn more and more about cancers, lung cancer is not one disease. Lung cancer is a whole bunch of rare diseases that are being lumped together. And so we're going to have to start thinking about many diseases down to the individual level. That's sort of the future of personalized medicine. And so the way we approach rare diseases is going to be very applicable to diseases in an era of personalized medicine.
In the summer of 2014, I think I was really struck by the ALS challenge, and it really got me thinking that it seems like there clearly is a stigma around a lot of these rare diseases, and we're seeing more of a conversation happening about these outside of Washington and finding a cure. Can you, and I'll once again pose this to all three of you, talk about the national conversation and getting people outside of the medical world talking about this, because there seems to be more of a motivation with a lot of these social media campaigns to support those who are fighting these illnesses every day or those who are impacted by this. Lori?
Yeah, absolutely. And ALS, I think, is a great example. The Ice Bucket Challenge happened right as I lost my mom. And I recall when she was first diagnosed in 2008 that I would say to people, my mom has ALS, and they would say, I don't know what that is. And today, as a result of a huge social media effort, ALS is on the radar screen for more and more people, and that has helped funding, individual donors contributing. It has helped change the national conversation. But I think the hard part, not just for someone with ALS, but for any rare disease, is when you have that disease, you are, almost entirely focused on living your day-to-day life. Your ability to go charge Capitol Hill or raise money is limited because, you're fighting to stay alive or hopefully find a treatment. And I think it's harder. I heard someone with the ALS Association say one time, unfortunately, when someone with ALS dies, their family is usually depleted and exhausted, and they just kind of want to go back to their normal life. And you don't have those champions that are going to come back and continue going to Capitol Hill. Many diseases, HIV/AIDS, many of the oncology conditions, those advocates often live today, and so that they can carry that legacy on and keep fighting. But because of the small number of patients that are impacted by rare disease, because these 80% are life-threatening or serious, their ability to kind of do the normal advocacy is challenged, which is why groups like Every Life and others are super important, because they help galvanize groups of organizations and tell that story, because it can be very difficult to do it. But social media, I do think, has changed a lot in a really positive way.
So I know this event is being live streamed, so if there's anyone out there publicly that is watching this and you have a rare disease and you want to be an advocate, the Every Life Foundation can help you. We are in the middle of our Rare Across America in-district lobby days program. You can sign up to meet with your member in your local district. We will train you how to tell your story. We'll let you know about the legislation that's pending. We also bring over 500 patients to Washington, D.C. at the end of February. We have travel stipends available. We are here to help patients advocate. One of the things I think is really critical to bringing kind of the public attention to rare diseases is that the communities are starting to realize that their challenges are the same. So while there's 7,000 different diseases, they all have the same problems with natural history studies, registries, finding researchers, finding physicians, getting access to treatment. So that understanding of the common challenges is really bringing the community together.
Carlene, tell me about, maybe some efforts of the National Cancer Institute to really, spread the word about rare diseases.
Yeah, definitely. So I work in the space of cancer, and we have just been funded by the Cancer Moonshot to start a patient engagement network. And so the idea there is that patients really are the beginning and the end of this process. And they've always been so important, but they haven't always felt their role, and they haven't always felt part of the team. So my part stands for My Pediatric and Adult Rare Tumor Network. But it really is about how everybody has an ownership in the process, and everyone's part is important. And that includes industry and regulatory and patient families and all of the different healthcare providers. So we are building this out and making it where we hope that people will be able to find us. People can participate in natural history studies from their home without having to come in. They can contribute their stories, and so we really want to learn from the patients and then make that data sort of collectible and useful for going forward to develop cures.
Right. So we have a couple minutes left for any questions that the audience might have. Does anyone have questions? In the meantime, I'll let you guys think. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Do we have a mic that can be passed? There we go.
I think it would be helpful if you characterized out of the 7,000 to 9,000 rare diseases, just to help illuminate the issue, a range of kind of on a high end and the low end, how many people are afflicted in the U.S., how many people are afflicted globally in each of these classifications, because they are significant numbers. They're smaller than mass impact, but they have very large patient populations.
Yeah, well, the technical definition of rare disease or orphan condition in the U.S. is 200,000 or below. The vast majority of patients, actually it's 10,000 or below. I want to say it's 60 to 70% of patients in the U.S. with an orphan condition are in the 10,000 or under range. So some of these are ultra rare conditions. Obviously there are some that have higher numbers, and even some like ALS where people say, is it really rare? Well, the reality is people die in a 2 to 5 year time frame on average. So the number of people living with that condition at any one time still meets the orphan definition. Outside the U.S., obviously, to your point, those numbers get bigger, but the way that it is defined in statute, and that matters because the incentives flow from that, are specific to the U.S.
Yeah, so whether or not something is rare is defined by population, and so something that might be rare here might be common in another country. Particularly in the case of cancer. Just to put some more numbers on it, it's estimated that 27% of all cancers fall into a rare cancer category, and rare cancers account for 25% of all cancer deaths. So it is a major issue in health.
I think we have time for one more. So just to wrap this up, just very briefly, let's talk about the future going forward. What can we expect to see in this field of studying in terms of rare diseases? Lori, if you want to go first.
Just quickly, there's over 500 medicines currently in development for rare disease. Unfortunately, the rates of approval for rare conditions are even worse than study of general conditions. So I think 94% of rare disease medicines being studied ultimately fail. But I do think there is hope as we learn more about other rare conditions. As was mentioned, that helps our broader understanding. So in my opinion, the hope is that we've got a lot of medicines in the pipeline, but we need to continue the incentives to ensure that there is an incentive for companies to continue to invest in this area.
I agree. We are in the golden age of rare disease drug development. However, every day we see companies shutting down clinical trials, pulling patients off drugs, selling off their rare disease divisions. We're at this tipping point. If policies change, if policies don't improve, we will not see these treatments that are so promising, and these cures, real cures, will not come to patients.
And I would say just that science-wise, it's really becoming a golden age with cloud computing. The ability to share data really is sort of allowing a lot more collaboration in the rare disease space. And I think collaboration is really key, and it's much more motivated in the rare disease space than in other diseases because you can't do it alone.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us. This was so informative. Thank you all.